this to make sure that it's videotaped and available. All right. Got to wear the team jacket for the video.
Adds to the flavor.
It does. It does. Part of the effect. Okay, let's talk about international space modeling. This is not a surprise to many of the audience, but for at least one of you, you haven't done this before. For two of you now, you haven't done it before. So let's talk about what this is all about. This is a form of competition that is really quite different from U.S. competition. In U.S. competition, frankly, even at NARCON, you can build a rocket on the field and win. That does not happen in international competition. This is a whole different level of competitions. It really is a way to measure yourself against the best in the world, because that's who you're flying against. Let me show you first just one example of how different this really is compared to what you normally see at a NARCON. I'm going to use a video here that James Duffy produced. This one happens to be from the 2006 Internats, where we traveled to Baikonur in Kazakhstan, the Russian space launch base for the World Championships. And the amount of special events that we had associated with that was pretty cool.
We're going to Baikonur.
Where we headed, Dave?
Baikonur.
Get on to Baikonur is
We're collecting hardware from the aircraft. This is a little memento of our rock and roll trip. Back in the U.S., back in the U.S., back in the USSR.
We've arrived at Banke. We're currently departing the aircraft, heading towards the terminal where we'll go through some screening and integration into the system, and then we'll get our shack.
So for the local country that's hosting one of these, this is a big deal. This is akin to the Olympics. So the opening ceremony is typically on the same scale the Olympics would be on. There's a march in for the teams from all the countries, behind the flag of their country, in front of a crowd which, Baikonur was the biggest crowd we've ever done this in front of. This was 15 or 20,000 people. Normally it's a little bit smaller crowd than that, but it's always an Olympic-style opening. Challenged by this video. Baikonur is an enclave of Russian-leased territory in the middle of the country of Kazakhstan. The people who run the Russian space launch complex at Baikonur are all Russians, and everything around them is desert in Kazakhstan. So it's a little island. There is nothing going on in Baikonur. So basically, when something like this happens, everybody who lives there shows up. We were in the soccer stadium, and they put on quite the opening ceremony. All the local high school kids dressed up in costumes, performing as scripted. Now they did this to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Baikonur's existence the previous year. So they just rolled out the same scripted uniforms. It's not like they did this just for us. But, you know, there is always some kind of opening event that involves native customs, native costumes, and native dancing. My 7th Internats, or I've been to 7 Internats, I've never seen anything like this. Okay, that was not NARCON. This is way different from NARCON. So there are typically 20 or 25 countries represented at one of these events. National teams are competitively selected, and they compete for the title of World Champion, which for us is World Champion, what? But for the people who live in these Eastern European countries particularly, it is a big deal. To say that you are a world champion is a matter of huge national personal prestige in their societies, so this is just not trivial. So when you fly in one of these things, you're flying against people who really, really want to win, who have flown the same events. There are 8 events that are internats, and it's always the same 8 events. The internats are fed by the equivalent of regional meets, which are called the World Cup events in FAI speak. And those 8 events, 5 of those 8 events are flown in all those contests. Nobody in the entire FAI modeling infrastructure flies anything except these 8 events. We fly these 8 events once every 2 years. They fly them about 10 times a year. A little mismatch in experience, but you have to make up for it or you just lose. We largely just lose. But we do respectably, and we're learning. There's a lot of repeat performers in our team, and as you do this multiple times and accumulate experience, you start moving up, and eventually, I hope, you'll be competitive enough that you can maybe not be an individual medalist, but the team perhaps can be in collective. The 3 people on the team can do well enough that as a team you can get a medal. And that's really what it's all about. It's flying as a team. You saw the travel over there. So it's the American team travels together, 40 of us or 45 or some number. Family members and others go. So it's usually a pretty big traveling party, by far the largest traveling party of any country. And you are teammates 24/7. You travel together, you get in the bus together, you get in airplanes together. You have hotel rooms that are adjacent. You almost always have a roommate. Every meal is eaten together. It is about as close a relationship as you can have with people who are your friends, and it's just completely dissimilar from a U.S. rocket meet where everybody goes to their own rooms and you meet on the field and everybody flies mostly as an individual. You always fly as a team. Whoever's flying is supported by everybody else on the team while they're flying. So it is truly team rocketry. It's a completely different dynamic and feeling compared to U.S. competition, which is largely an individual-based thing. This is entirely team-based. You get to see other interesting places. Some of them are nice, some of them, well, the local people always do their very best to put on the best face and the best show and the best hospitality that they possibly can within the limits of their culture. These are normally held in Eastern Europe. There was one recently held in Spain. So sometimes they don't have a lot to work with, but they do their very best. They absolutely put everything out to make sure that you feel welcome and that you enjoy the experience. You can see what the Russians did. The Russians were trying to just prove that nobody can do what we can do. So they pulled out all the stops. But every country does the best they can within their limits. This is expensive. So you're talking, not counting all of your model work, whatever it takes you to produce the models, which can be a lot depending on what your particular event is. You're talking $3,000 of travel per person. And for the juniors, there's a subsidy from the NAR that covers, I don't know, maybe half of that. And to get ready for this is about a 2-year process. And so you don't just work on the stuff the week or 2 before. This is a dedicated, committed experience for a long period of time that results in a 2-week trip that costs you about $3,000 to go fly 3 flights in one event, or maybe if you have 2 events, 6 flights in 2 events. Nobody gets more than 2 events. So there's a pretty big incentive to not screw up and DQ. I traveled 7,000 miles and spent $3,000 to DQ. How does that feel? How does that sound? That's not what you want to do. International competition is run by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, which is based in Lausanne, Switzerland. This is one of many things they do with respect to aeronautics. They are the international organization for records and competition in all forms of aeronautics, including manned flight. So this is one of the smallest niche activities inside the overall FAI structure. The people who run FAI work through a sub-bureau called the CIAM, the Council for International Aero Modeling, which is largely dominated by model airplane types. Then there's space modeling is sort of an afterthought. The airplane types all look down their noses at us. And we have the most vibrant, largest participation of any of the disciplines within aero modeling, and really the only one that has significant youth participation. So they're all going to die of old age and go away and become irrelevant over the next 20 years, and space modeling will remain. So we'll just outlast it. The competition structure and rules are really different. The international rules are, you can actually find them in the U.S. Pink Book now for some of the events. There are FAI parachute, FAI streamer, and so forth that have the equivalent of the FAI rules, but by and large, the FAI specifies a lot about what your rocket has to look like. It has to be, for many of the events, it has to be 500 millimeters long, 19.4 inches. It has to be 40 millimeters in diameter. That's like a BT-60 almost. For half of that length, whatever the length is, you can't have a motor that's smaller than 10.5 millimeters in diameter. There are all kinds of requirements that are imposed. They're a little different for glider events, and scale's a little more open. But they're very prescriptive, and so everybody has rockets that are the same shape, mostly. Not true in steel or one of the others, but in most of the events, they all look the same more or less externally. So the question is, how good are you at optimizing within those constraints? The constraints didn't used to be there. I've been flying this stuff since 1985, international competition. And they didn't used to have all those restraints, but the rockets became pencil-sized, tiny things that just disappeared. Nobody could see them. And because of the level of performance that you get in the international competition, so they've progressively made the rocket sizes, required size, bigger and bigger and bigger to hold down the altitude so that you have some chance of actually seeing the rocket during its flight. It's a challenge. This rocket is a helicopter duration model, for example. And the body tube for this is made of fiberglass. It weighs about 5 grams. And the whole rocket's under 20 grams. Big rockets, the size of a Big Bertha, almost less than 20 grams. So there's entirely different construction techniques, but those construction techniques apply directly to U.S. competition. So the skills that you learn in doing this really transfer nicely to U.S. competition. Maybe you don't necessarily build rockets that are this shape, but the building techniques you learn really put you ahead in U.S. competition. There are, as I mentioned previously, there's a whole set of events called World Cups that are the equivalent of NAR regionals that are 2 or more countries that meet to compete for 2-3 days. There's one of them in the United States each year. Last year, I hosted one called the Capital Cup in outside Washington, D.C. This year, the Great Lakes Cup, hosted by Pat Butler in Oswego, Illinois, will be held in June. And there'll be a Canadian event the next day, hosted by Pat in Oswego, Illinois, but run by Karas Qatar. So there are about 25 of those each year. And then the World Space Modeling Champs is every 2 years, even numbered years currently. And the next one is in Kazakhstan. Where's that? Bulgaria, at the end of August. This will be the 3rd time that I've been to Bulgaria for World Championships. And I guess it's better. My perspective from the previous 2 is I didn't leave anything there. I needed to go back and visit. The previous 2 times I was there was during the Cold War. It was not friendly. Bulgaria was a real satellite of the Soviets. They really liked the Soviets. They were the only satellite country that liked the Soviets. So it wasn't very friendly, but apparently it's much nicer. It's still a poor country that's entirely agricultural, but they have, as is the case in most of these East European hosted events, gigantic flying fields, enormous, miles on a side, flat, usually miles. The NAR manages American participation in this. The AMA, the Airplane Association, manages the overall aero modeling competition for FAI in the United States, but they've delegated rocketry to the NAR because they didn't like it and they weren't doing well. So we do a competitive team selection, fly-off. In the odd-numbered NARMs, last year's NARM, we did a competitive selection to select who will be on the U.S. team. There's pretty good competition to get on the team, at least in the adults. And the juniors, you have to do a good qualified flight. It's not quite as competitive. But for the adults, it's tough to get on the team because people are starting to learn that this is a great experience and it really is a challenge to your skills and it's fun. So there's pretty good competition to get on the team. We have 2 teams, a junior team, 18 and under, and a senior team. And both of them are significant in size. The junior team is maybe 15. The adult team is a little bigger than that. And then when we travel over there, the junior team mostly has parents that go with them, some of whom are flyers, most aren't. And then there's other people who just want to go for the experience. And so we add up to a traveling party of 45 or 50 people, which is twice the size of any other nation's traveling party. The guy who runs international competition, Sir John Pelkey, made the observation the time before last. He came by the U.S. tent and looked around at what we were doing, and we're not intense cutthroat. We're going to win. It's all about the prestige. We're not going to win. So we're a little more laid back, and the kids. They have a lot of kids, and kids have a lot of parents. And he said, "For Americans, this is a family event." Yeah, it is. It really is. It's a lot of fun. It's a great experience for the young people to do it, which is why the NAR provides a subsidy for the juniors, not the seniors. The seniors got to pay their own way, but the NAR subsidizes part of the cost of the juniors, and John Langford's company, Aurora Flight Sciences, also matches the NAR's contribution. So John Langford is the team manager, and he's the real spark plug behind the success of our program. He was a competitor himself for many years. So this is a picture of us in Liptovsky Mikulas. Where's that? Slovakia. You go to really obscure corners of Eastern Europe. Liptovsky Mikulas was like, you remember the scenery and the sound of music. It's kind of like that. It was just gorgeous. We stayed in this resort next to a water park in the middle of God knows where, Slovakia, the northern part of Slovakia. But we could walk to the flying field, which is unusual, and the accommodations they were actually respectable. I mean, so we always stay in hotels that by local standards are 4-star. Usually that equates to half a star in U.S. standards. But in this particular case, these are pretty nice accommodations. This was very comfortable. And the food wasn't even bad. Sometimes the food is pretty sketchy. So the team members had uniforms. I'm wearing the U.S. team uniform. And so we all wear those uniforms at group events like this was before the, I think, the opening ceremony. And you wear the team uniform when you're flying. But when you're not flying, but you're supporting the people who are flying, you wear whatever it takes to go out and find a parachute model 5 miles downrange. So it's an athletic event. So I said, being a teammate's a 24/7 thing. You are together. If you don't like your teammates, you're going to have a really bad time. If you have people on the team who aren't good teammates, it becomes real obvious real soon who the people are who aren't good teammates. And so we don't have any people like that on our team currently. It's really a cohesive group, which is why those of us that do it tend to want to keep doing it, because it really is fun and you really like the people you're doing this with. You better. Because you're sitting next to them in a bus, you're sharing a hotel room with one of them, you eat every single meal together. You socialize together. The bottom left is the closing banquet, which is the only time that the East Europeans let their guard down and are actually friendly after they have won their medals. And it's party time. They are pretty fun, but they're pretty intense up until that point. And then you usually get to tour someplace that's pretty nice. The one on the bottom right there is Red Square in Moscow from 2016. But there's always some local attraction that's usually, maybe it's not something you've ever heard of, but it turns out generally to be pretty neat. In Slovakia, they had some caves that were equivalent to, not quite Carlsbad Caverns, but more like the Ray Caverns. It was really nice. And so they do their very best to show off their country and give you an opportunity to enjoy parts of it as part of your experience. And as you saw from the video, there's a march-in associated with this, just as there is in an Olympics, where the team marches in their uniforms behind the flag of their country. So it's a big deal representing your country. That's another really special part of the experience. You saw this in the video. This was over the top. Never seen anything like this before at Internats. This was at the other end of the spectrum. This was in Spain. These are people in a white outfit, roller skating. So they were costume roller skate dancers in a high school gym, and the crowd was a couple hundred people. This was the best part of the ceremony. Then there was the Moors and the Christians, which was, the place we were holding this light up was in about the point where the upper extent of where the Moors got back when Spain was half occupied by the Moors as Muslims. And so there were the Moors who were the Muslims, and then there's the Christian knights and so forth who were supposedly the good guys who ended up winning. So they both march in their costumes looking just like that. Marching in it was more like a funeral march at 1 step per second, which is the funeral pace as you march in. They marched the entire circumference of the high school gym at that pace. It took like 20 minutes. It was excruciating. And then it ended up, they were at opposite ends of the gym in their little formations, and I thought, okay, now it's going to get cool. They're going to charge at each other and wail on each other. It was just off. More commonly, it's folk dancing, so that's pretty fun to watch. That is the village that is built, was built in Baikonur. So Baikonur, as I mentioned, is Russian property in the middle of, at least in the middle of Kazakhstan and the desert of Kazakhstan. And so they bussed us way out into the desert where they had built a city of pavilion-type tents with a plywood or wooden street down the row of tents. The launch range is on the left. They had a yurt, which is a Kazakh nomad-type living quarters right there, which is what they use for changing room. And they have, porta potties. They planted plants. They planted grass. There's no grass here. They planted grass out in the launch pad area so that we weren't sitting on dirt when we flew. They went absolutely over the top. You can see a space tracking antenna on the left out on the horizon. Over on the right, there is a Soyuz launch tower that you can see just on the horizon, and camels would walk by. There are wild camels on the field. So you knew that, for me, I spent 28 years in the military, mostly during the Cold War. And the idea that I would be over in Baikonur with binoculars, camera, GPS, and radio, that would have been an American doing that in Baikonur. I was welcomed rather than 30 years in the Gulag. So it just was surreal. That's the tent city. There's always a tent city. They don't always pave the street with wood, and tents aren't always this nice. Sometimes they're dark army tents that tend to absorb heat. But there's always a tent for each nation, or in the case of the Americans, sometimes 2 tents because our delegation is so big. And that's where the team hangs out, and it's where you do all your prepping and so forth. So the logistics and infrastructure associated with putting one of these on is quite extensive. There's a lot that they do, and they're expected to do. And so that's way beyond what you typically see at an air. It's closer, frankly, for those of you that have been to the TARC finals, it's closer to the TARC finals, really, than to an airman. This is the U.S. team hanging out inside the prep tent. This is basically where you go when you don't have anything else to do. When the team is flying, the 6 people who are flying, 3 juniors are flying one event at the same time as 3 seniors are flying another event. And everybody else on the team is out of the tent, out there figuring out what they can do to detect thermals, help the people prep, chase the rockets downwind, whatever it takes. That's what you're there for. It's a team thing, and you're expected to be out on the field doing whatever it takes to help your teammates when it's their turn to fly, and they return the favor to you. This is way different from an NARCON competition. And typically you arrive out on the field at dawn, and the award ceremony at the end of the day where they present the medals is done by either floodlights or headlights, but it's usually in the dark.
So it's a one-day event?
No, it's a 5 days of flying with 1 day of practice. So it's about a 7-day commitment. They have 1 day off for rain, but they're 5 flying days. So they're 8 events. Scale is flown by itself typically. So it's like a death march. By the time you were done, you were hit. You've been getting up at like 6 in the morning, loading on a bus, going out to the field. You come back, you get dinner at like 8 p.m. And then you have to get your models checked in for the next day's events, those of you that are flying the next day. You're hallucinating by the end of the week. It's pretty intense. It's all part of the experience. It makes a great memory. The experience maybe real time is maybe not so pleasant, but the memories are just marvelous, and the stories you can tell afterwards. A number of my teammates are sitting in the back row chuckling because they know the stories. It's fun. If it weren't fun, we wouldn't be doing this repeatedly. I've done this is my 7th time, and most of the rest of the guys here have done it more than once. This is a picture of the flight range. So every country has an alley. The alley is maybe 10 feet wide and 15 or 20 feet deep. It's marked off by tape like this, and it has your pads in it. And although the organizers provide a set of electric leads with microclips on the end of it for a central control box, literally nobody uses it. Everybody brings their own electrical control launch system and brings their own pads, pistons, towers, whatever. And so every country has this collection of hardware in their lane. And so the East European, there is a safety code in FAI. It says the same things that ours does. I'll leave it at that. So I think the minimum requirement of the safety code is that you have to at least let go of the rocket as it moves. But typically you're 3 feet from the rocket when it lifts off. Now the motors that fit in here are the size, they're this long, they're smaller than your little finger. So these are A motors. It's not like this is really intimidating. When you have a scale model flying with lots of big motors in it, people back way off. This is dangerous. But what can I say? The safety code is acknowledged but not followed. Nobody gets hurt. But everybody's packed close together. So during the course of an 80-minute round, each of the 3 people on the team for that event, from each of the 20 or 25 nations, have to get a flight off through the single RSO. So you hold your paddle up and you acknowledge as you count down. Every team has 2 timers assigned to them permanently. That is assigned to them for the round, and then the timers rotate between rounds. So your team of 3 people has 2 timers, that's it. And you can't all fly at once. So you have to take turns and split the 80-minute time block that's available and share it, because the 2 timers can only do one of you at a time. And so you have to figure that out as an event team. Who's going to fly first, and make sure that you leave enough time for the other people on your event team to get their flights off within that same 80-minute window. And you're allowed to bring 1 timer that you contribute to the common pool, and the organizer makes up the difference. So the infrastructure associated with running one of these, there are 20-some lanes for the seniors and maybe 15 or 20 for the juniors. So there's maybe 40 lanes going with 2 timers each. There's 80 timers that the organizer has to come up with. Each country can bring 1, and that 1 gets a free admission. So that's 20 of the 80. The other 60 are figure it out. And so it's really tough to run one of these. We haven't run one of these in the United States since '92. And the last one we ran was a disaster. We ran a great one in 1980, but back then the expectations of infrastructure and support and so forth were much lower. I would guess that if you were to run one of these now in the United States, which we couldn't do, it would be, you'd need at least $500,000 of sponsorship money to meet the expectations that have been set. The East Europeans use whatever, a local aero club, local scouts, whatever, but they have significant government support, and so they come up with local people who are called volunteers. This is the U.S. Junior Radio-Controlled Rocket Glider team. They did quite well. Not as well in 2012 as they did in 2010, but they're good flyers. 2 of them are named Stenberg, and one was Dave O'Brien's son. But these are not standard size. There's a minimum wingspan that you're allowed to have, but the design is much more freeform than for other events. This is a scale modeler. This is Alexander Levek, who won scale and basically wins scale every time he flies almost, with the Soyuz model that he put several thousand hours into. It has how many different pieces that come down, 17 or some huge number of pieces.
It's an extraordinary number.
Yeah, each stage, I mean, the side boosters drop off and they have their own parachutes, and these stages, and I think twice, and then he has a payload that comes out, and it's like 17 different pieces coming out of the sky, and if any one of those pieces fails to deploy its recovery device, the flight is disqualified. So he has to have an extraordinarily complex sequence of events happen with pieces just raining out of the sky, staging a complex scale model that, well, I won't say it has to go straight up, although his does. It has to not be aimed down under thrust at any point. That's about the standard. I'd think about half the scale flights end up DQing, because the scoring system rewards complexity to such an extent that the models are just mind-numbingly complex. And so they have a very high propensity to not work very well. But not his. He is a pro. He's really good. That's his flight. You can see on the left, things coming off with parachutes deploying. That was the moment of, I think, stripping the strap-ons on the side. And he has, I don't know how many motors he has flying. You get bonus points for clustering also. So he has 6 or 8 motors going at once in the bottom stage. Just extraordinary. This is the Polish team loading their scale models. I'm going to show a video here in just a second of scale. It's pretty fun. So they don't all work. Those are 2 that really didn't work at all. And let me show you a brief video that James Duffy here produced about some others. Let's see, scale. That was a good scale flight, coming straight up. This is the Polish team.
Another one bites the dust.
Just remember, that was somebody's 10,000-hour project. That didn't work. You get the point. So with complexity comes reliability challenges, and you see that played out. But remember, these guys are going for the gold. And so they have absolutely every incentive in the world to go absolutely all out. And they take huge risks in order to get huge rewards of winning. Doesn't always work. The U.S. team approach is not quite that way. I think the way to describe what we do is we want to be the most photographed rocket. We fly just cool stuff. I mean, Steve flew the Apollo capsule with the escape motors being his propulsion. The capsule, I mean, they did do a test where they stripped the capsule off, a little joke doing that, so it's a legitimate scale model. There wasn't anybody that wasn't watching that flight. They had never seen anything like that. Chris Flanagan flew an N1 time before last. Nobody's ever done a scale model of the N1 moon vehicle before at the Internet. Everybody stops, all photograph it. I mean, you have no chance of winning, no chance. But nobody's going to ever forget those flights. So I think that's sort of the way the U.S. scale team has adapted itself to the realities of international competition. They have a good time, they're good at it. So part of the other experience here is that the presentation of medals is at the Olympic scale of, grandeur. And so at the medal ceremony, people stand on the podium. Young ladies in whatever the local costume is come up with the medals on a tray. The medals are hung over the necks of the winners as they are at the Olympics. And then they hoist the flags of the three countries of the gold, silver, and bronze, and they play the national anthem of the country who won the gold. It's a big deal. And I could come along with the Russian national anthem because I've heard the damn thing so often. You don't hear the Star Spangled Banner too much, but we have heard it a couple times. But you hear the Russian national anthem just altogether too much, and it sounds like a funeral dirge, as do all of the East European national anthems. It sounds like you're at a funeral. So you're always happy when a Western European country wins for an American team, because at least you hear music that has some pep to it. All the East European national anthems are funeral-like. This is an award ceremony. This is the U.S. junior team, which actually won gold in the Radio Control Rocket Fighter event 2010. So we heard the Star Spangled Banner. Note that it's dark. This was held in the dark. This is standard medal ceremony in the days after dark. Remember, this is the summer, so after dark it's late. So part of the experience is touring. So here we are at Cape Kennedy, and there we were at Baikonur, the Soviet-Russian Cape Kennedy. As I mentioned, it's an outpost of Russia in the middle of Kazakhstan, leased by Russia from the nation of Kazakhstan. And that's the launch pad from which Yuri Gagarin flew to space as the first human being to ever go into orbit. They had flown a Soyuz to the International Space Station the day before we arrived from that same pad. So they still used the same vehicle launches system as they did then. Now they built other new ones, but they also built the whole huge infrastructure of facilities for their own space shuttle, the Buran, for their N1, and for a space program that was on a much grander scale than what they can afford anymore. And all those facilities that are no longer in use are in complete disrepair and ruin. They have the only thing they've really preserved with a sense of history is a little cosmonaut house that Yuri Gagarin spent the night in before his flight. That's like a national shrine. Everything else is just whatever. It's not making money. Let it go. It's in ruins and disrepair, laying on the desert. The Buran's just parked out in the desert. A Buran. I think it's not the real one. I think it's the second one. I think the real one is inside a hangar that collapsed. The roof collapsed, and they put more antennas on it than the roof was capable of supporting because they didn't bother to do any engineering, structural engineering, so it collapsed on top of the Buran. So they don't care. It's all about money. And if you're not making money, you're not interested in modern Russia. But the opportunity to tour things is part of the experience, and we had an extraordinary opportunity to tour space facilities at Baikonur. In fact, I'm going pretty fast here, so at the end of this, I'll show you a little video about Baikonur that James did. So yesterday, a few of us had a chance to go into the building where they assemble Delta 2s, or Delta 4s now. This was the building where they assembled Soyuz. So those are the parts, those are the strap-on boosters that they used to assemble the Soyuz, and there were 20 or 30 of them. They're just sort of like Legos, they just snap them together, roll out. But they know what they're doing. This is the same basic launch system that they've used for 50 years, extraordinarily reliable, works just fine. It puts guys in orbit. We can't do that permanently. They can. So don't look down your nose at the technology, because their technology is just good enough. And better can be the enemy of good enough. Here's the Buran, or a Buran. I think that's the second one. Didn't fly. The one that flew in space, I think, is the one that's ruined. Notice for those of you that have been to the Kennedy Space Center Museum and seen the shuttle on display there, extraordinary. It's like a shrine. They lost the Cold War. So that's their Buran. And that's about how they treat it. It's just sitting out there weathering away in the desert like a movie. Okay, so how do you do this stuff? It's hard, but it's not that hard. Anybody can do it, but you probably won't do it well the first time. It takes maybe one cycle to become fairly proficient. The rule book is on the FAI website. There's a ton of information that Chris Flanagan and I put together on the US NAR website. It's under International Competition. There is dozens of pages of content. It's literally everything anybody in America knows about how to do FAI space modeling is on the NAR website. So all the tutorial material is there. When I picked this up again, I did this in the 80s and went away from it for a while and came back in 2006. And there was almost nothing available to learn this from. It was talk to people, people sent private notes back and forth. So it was hard for me to pick it up again because so much had changed. So that is no longer true. So there's plenty of tutorial material teaching you how to do this. NARCS sells the mandrels that you use, the machined aluminum mandrels that you use to make these. We're trying to make it as easy as possible so that people throughout the NAR can get involved in this. It's in our interest to have our very best modelers try this. The modeling techniques, I'll pass this around, but this is typical. So this is a helicopter model. So it has blades inside that deploy like this, comes down like this. And this fiberglass tube here is a little thicker than a spider web, but not a lot. So I'll pass this around so you can feel it. This is Tim Van Milligan's model, so not mine, so don't be gentle with it. And this is not the best we can do. This is pretty good. So this is typical of the modeling techniques. It uses lightweight fiberglass, 0.5 to 0.75 ounce cloth as your basic structural building material. This is a vacuum-formed plastic nose cone. This is foam that you use for house insulation, that you just cut into a little disc. And nobody uses paper tube models. Now this is an apogee kit that Tim will be releasing that complies with the FAI requirements for dimensions, but he's using a paper body tube here instead of this just for ease, because these takes some stuff to make these kind of hard. This is just a body tube. This probably weighs 4 times as much as this.
So that would be
This is a kit just if you want to fly FAI parachute duration under the NAR Pink Book and comply with the dimension rules. You will have a kit so that you can do it, but the weight of the kit, the weight of the body,
it would qualify but not be competitive.
Yeah, it's not competitive. Now for parachute, your basic requirement is you pump out a 36-inch diameter quarter-mil Mylar chute and you can fly a brick. It doesn't matter. For all the other events, the body weight really matters. So actually, if you're going to do parachute, it's all about a big chute, getting it open 100%, and this actually will work out okay. But I'll pass this one around so that you can touch it. Don't touch it hard, though. The real challenge that we face is that the rocket motors that are used in competition flying internationally for most of the events, certainly the parachute, streamer, altitude, for many of the events except for scale and radio control rocket glider, are precision made for competitive purposes under FAI rules. So they're tiny little things. They're 1.5 inches long, 10 millimeters in diameter, which is like 0.4 inches. They have a very high energy propellant loaded into them. They aren't all that expensive, but they aren't made in America. They can't be imported into America legally because they haven't been classified by the Bureau of Explosives under the Department of Transportation regulations. So you can't get them here. And so we end up going over there and flying with motors that we have had very little opportunity to practice with. And so it's a real challenge. They have very different characteristics. They're great motors. They have like 2.49 Newton seconds of total impulse in a 2.5 Newton second event. And if they do static testing before the internets and some of them are a little high, then they just put them in the refrigerator and chill them until they, it's bizarre. Anyway, so the unavailability of those motors for the U.S. is a real constraint on our ability to develop proficiency in those events. It is not, however, the limiting path. The limiting path is pure modeling skill. The motors, you need to be able to be proficient with those motors because they make the rocket behave somewhat differently than a U.S. motor would do. The ejection charges are tiny compared to an Estes motor. The thrust is lower. And so the airframe will behave somewhat differently with one of those, and those differences matter at the high end of competition. But if you can make a reliable rocket that flies with an Estes A3, the transition to use these motors has to be done, but it's not that hard. So it is a disadvantage, but it's not a killer. We have the best motors in the world for radio control rocket glider, Aerotech 40 Newton second E motors. Absolutely dominate. Wow. But that's the only event. So we have to deal with how do you practice? So we have it's kind of a strange story. So John Langford, who's a team manager, owns an aerospace company. And one of the airplanes that his company makes is an optionally manned airplane. The airframe is made in Austria. His company customizes the airframe so that it can be flown unmanned or manned for whoever, law enforcement or other missions. So once every year or so, they fly one of those airplanes from Austria to the United States to take it to the Aurora plant in Manassas and customize it. And so John, whenever that happens, John gets a significantly large shipment of these international motors, throws it in the back of his airplane, and they fly it across the Atlantic on his airplane. And then we have a supply of motors that are then hand-delivered to members of the team to practice with, because you can't mail them. They're not classified for shipment in the U.S. And so members of the team, once they make the team, can get their hands on some motors to practice with. The ways that we have to, the things we have to go through to do that are pretty interesting. I mentioned previously that there are 8 events in the internet, and unlike NARCON, which is different events every time, they're pretty interesting for that reason. It's always the same 8 events. Now that can either be it's very comforting for the East Europeans because they really want to win. And so they want to practice this for 10, 20, 30 years. They're really proficient at it, and they hate seeing rule changes because it means that all those years of practice have got them this close to getting a gold medal and being, world champion. It's all blown away and they have to rethink it. Now for us, completely different mindset. You want new events at NARCON every year because you want to do something different. That is not their mindset. Rules, protocol, familiarity, I would call it boring. They lived behind the Iron Curtain for 50 years. It's just normal for them. So anyway, so it's always the same 8 events. 3 of them have different power classes by age division. When I say the same 8 events, I mean the same event and power class. It is A parachute duration, period. Never B, never half A, period. So you're working on the margins of making your performance 1% better, 2% better. You're not dealing with something that's a complete unknown, it's an open book, new design approach. You are constantly refining within a very narrow window. Scale is not quite that way, and rocket glider is a little more free form, but most of the events are very repetitive. So it's parachute duration, streamer duration, helicopter, they call it auto gyro duration. Altitude, which is a 2-stage altitude event with tiny altimeters. There's glider events, A boost glide, which is free flight, which what they call boost glide, we would call rocket glider. Under their rules, it's actually a rocket glider. There really aren't too many limits on that other than it has to weigh 18 grams of liftoff. But you can use this. You have a lot of freedom and flexibility to innovate in the design for that. But on the events at the top, everybody's model has the basic same profile. It's just a question of optimization of drag and so forth within that very fixed profile. A lot more freedom of innovation and maneuver in the glider events, A boost glide and radio control rocket glider. And the scale events are significant challenges for craftsmanship. The standard of excellence is thousands of hours go into your model. I could never do that. I certainly have great respect for the people who do have the patience to do that. It's the prestige event. S7, the scale event, is the prestige event at the Internet. Everything stops. As you saw, the crowd stopped. Everybody watches every flight. Winning the international title of world champion in scale is the thing. Closely followed maybe by radio control rocket glider world champion. Everything else is, scale altitude is a little down from that, and everything else is just in a different place. We're going to shake the system up this year. We have managed to get the TARC rules essentially into the international rule book, and we think the Bulgarians are going to fly that event as a demonstration event at this World Championships, and it is deliberately revolutionary. And that, like TARC, there's a goal specified of carry an egg and get an altitude target and a duration target, and there are no limits on airframe, dimension, size, nothing. It will absolutely shake your world. So we're going to go there and make some noise with big rockets that have F motors in them. And so I think they'll like it. And we'll see how many of them put together a team to compete with us in that event. But this will be the first time that this event has been flown in the World Championship, and it'll only be a demonstration event, not for FAI medals. So I mentioned that we use fiberglass, very light cloth, formed over a male mandrel. It's machined out of aluminum in the shape of from here down. So you put mold release on it and you lay the fiberglass cloth on it, and then the fiberglass cures, and you heat the mold slightly, and the mold release releases, and just slip the body off carefully so that it doesn't just crumple in your hands. It's very, very thin, as you felt from this, and that's sort of heavy. I'll show you a picture here in a minute. You have, because you have a 500 millimeter thing to work with, and the nose cone is a fixed part of it, 250 millimeters of it has to be 40 millimeters in diameter, and that leaves you with basically a boat tail down here, which is a 5-degree boat tail. If you want a longer cylindrical part to fit helicopter blades in or something, you can have a more sharper angle of the boat tail, but basically the latest design for helicopter uses a 5-degree boat tail, so they all look about the same. Fins are 1/32 inch balsa. So these things are designed to fly on motors whose average thrust is 1.5 to 2 newtons. So you can see them just go like this, very, very slow, very low speed, very low drag, very low loading on the structure of the model. So you can't fly a model like this with an SSB motor. It will disassemble itself. So these are optimized, and what you want is a model that is just on the verge of disintegrating on boost. Because if you do, then it's just light enough. Which is why it's important to have the motors to practice with, because if you don't get that right, then your model's either too heavy or it disassembles itself on boost. And you'd like to not have that happen at the Internet. The nose cone is either vacuum formed plastic or a couple layers of fiberglass draped over a mantle and formed out of fiberglass. Apogee makes the nose cones from vacuum formed plastic they're formed. The fins are very thin. You have a ejectable foam plug, not wadding, which you use to protect your recovery device, and the things are really light. That's a mandrel sitting on a holder, so it's machined out of aluminum. NARC sells them. They're $125 or so. One-time investment. You need one of them, and then you're good forever. I happen to have two, but that's just because I've kind of got an assembly line going where I make lots of these things just to make sure that I have a lot to pick from to pick the very best. And you can see the tissue, gap tissue, and then the fiberglass that's been cut out, ready to be draped over the mantle with the West Systems epoxy resin that we use. This is what the tail looks like, which you've seen one of these that I passed around. I mentioned earlier that they're flown in rounds, so they're flown in 80-minute rounds, and you get a max score. So for a duration event like a helicopter, the max is 180 seconds. Times beyond 180 seconds don't count, but if you score less than the max, you're probably not going to be competitive. So many people at the end of the first 3 rounds have 3 maxes. Then you go into a fly-off round where they raise the max, and then the survivors have to compete in that fly-off round, and then if there's any survivors after that, which there never are except a parachute duration, then the final round is unlimited duration, which is more typical of an AR event. Three rounds, 3 flights, 2 models. The rounds are 80 minutes apart. So In the first 80 minutes, you fly your first model. In the second 80 minutes, you fly your second model. And in the third 80 minutes, you don't have a model unless your teammates have gone downrange and found it for you. If you do have a model and you didn't have to have your teammates recover it, it's because you DQ'd. You're done. So all these models, if you put them in the right air, thermals, and you do a great job of picking thermals, are going to go a long way. Ideally, you'd like a dethermalizer on them so that you can have them drop out of the sky at the max time, 5 minutes for parachute or 3 minutes for helicopter or streamer. That's really popular with your recovery team because then they don't have to go 5 miles, pick up your bottle or find it or chase it or whatever. We don't do very well at thermalizing. Frequently, we're not good enough to have that be an issue anyway. So we have really good recovery crews because we don't know how to do dethermalization very well. We know how to do recovery. We put like 20 people downrange with radios and GPS and cars, and we're really good at it. So, and that's what all the people on the team who aren't flying are doing. They're downrange in various echelons with a radio grid going and working it out, recovering the models. I mentioned already that you have 3 people that have to share the 2 timers during the course of an 80-minute round. And we always use piston launchers and towers. Nobody uses launch rods. And picking thermals is key. So we take over a set of recording thermometer instruments that we use to detect the presence of thermals, bubbles of hot air that pass through. We're pretty good at that too. Yeah, so we're really good at thermals, we're really good at recovery, and then our flying skills are, well, not good enough. That's me prepping a streamer model from a piston launcher that is inside a tower. What's competitive? Super, super lightweight, perfect surface finish. For streamer, it's origami, 1 mil Mylar streamer with folding techniques that are closely held secrets in each nation's team. That's why I call it origami. The folding technique gives you the flapping that you need to maximize your duration. It's pretty arcane. Parachute, you need to deploy basically a 1 meter diameter, 1/4 mil parachute perfectly, exactly at apogee. Full instant deployment, put it in the thermal, and hope your recovery team's really good. And there are great stories about the U.S. recovery team and GPS and anyway, cars. Cars going where cars shouldn't have gone. Rental cars returned with anyway, damage. Just put it that way. Going overland. For boost glider, mostly they use variable geometry, swing wing designs. For helicopter, you've seen a pretty good helicopter design. These are nice blades. This is a good design. That's fairly typical of the internets. For altitude, they're all 2-stage. And the 2 stages are separated by about this much. They use a little flash tube to duct the ejection from the lower engine right into the nozzle of the upper engine. So it's 2-stage altitude. That's my favorite event. They use electronic altimeters that are about the size of your little fingernail. Scale, thousands of hours of work is the entry level. And 50% of those crash. And radio controlled glider, that is a real test of construction, flying, and landing skills. That is precision duration, precision landing. So 5-minute duration, and land it precisely in a certain spot, and you lose points for every centimeter, basically, that you missed the precision landing point, and you lose points for every second. Your goal is to land in precisely 5 minutes, and you lose points if it's 5 minutes and 1 second, or 4 minutes and 9 seconds. So it's an extreme flying skill. Yeah.
Do you lose more or less for being over or under?
I think you lose less for being under. But, I mean, the winners don't miss by more than a second.
Okay.
Then they come in and then they just go wham, right down on the point target. So the noses are hardened so that when they hit the ground, they don't, I mean, they're hitting the ground like this so that they stick. Because if they slide, then they're measuring where you stop, not where you first hit.
Oh, okay.
This is origami. This is a streamer, typical folding technique. Those are Russian swing wing gliders. So the wings rotate 90 degrees and then fold, or fold and rotate. So the wings are oriented this way on boost and they're half the span. That's pretty standard for the design. That's a helicopter model. You've seen a good one. That's I think that's Antonio Mazzaracchio's E1. You see, he has a second section in his blades that unfolds. So how do you get on the team? Well, you compete. Next NARCON, not this year, but next year there'll be a competitive fly-off. Go to the website, learn how to do it, practice how to do it. It's held the first weekend of odd-numbered NARCONs. That'll be next year. There are more competitors than slots. So if you practice some beforehand, you have a chance. Maybe the second time you go compete and get on the team, you'll get on. Sometimes the first, but if you're persistent, you can make the team. The juniors, much easier odds to make the team. The fly-offs are flown only with U.S. certified motors, S's A3s and equivalent, so you can't bring in ringer motors. So everybody's operating on the same playing field of suboptimal motors. And you compete to get on the team, then you switch to using European motors. You got to pay your own way. It's expensive. And once you get on the team, then the work begins. The expectation is that you're not going to go over and screw up. So you better start practicing. We have a great support structure inside the team. We're constantly communicating with each other, passing tips back and forth. And we go to the World Cup events that we host here, the Capital Cup and Great Lakes Cup, to compete against each other and practice. So come fly with us. If you aren't already on the team, which the back row mostly is, the rest of you, give it a shot. It's fun. It's rewarding. It's a great challenge, and the skills that you learn will transfer directly to being good at NAR competition. Okay?
What's the barrier to making, for someone here to make motors of that quality?
$10,000 of, it takes about $10,000 to get a motor certified by the Department of Transportation for classified for shipment. And then there's whatever the startup cost is of motor machinery and so forth, but it's mostly the $10,000, and then your market is tiny. So you will never make it back from the market. Somebody's just got to throw away $10,000 one time to get these things certified.
That's sort of, is kind of my question, is why hasn't someone stepped up?
So the Europeans that, well, I don't know why somebody hasn't built a machine in the U.S.
Well, do they have to have a machine? I understand the Europeans can make them.
Well, yeah, you can do that. The Europeans regularly blow their residences up. Right. So anyway, so that's part of the impediment. Then the Europeans also are doing this almost completely outside the law. And so they're not officially recognized companies, so they don't have the licenses to do this. They just do it. You don't want to know, but every now and then one of their homes disappears. And so they don't want to become officially known by going through the rigorous classification process and being publicly revealed. This is a black market, a niche subterranean culture of passing motors back and forth that are all made.
Yeah, they don't mail motors in Europe either.
Yeah, they all drive them across borders. Okay.
And the thing that's left out of that discussion is that for 2.5 of the events, the U.S. motors are the best to have.
Yeah. For
Nobody
scale
ever
and rocket
discusses
glider,
that.
we have dominant motors and we ship them over at extraordinary difficulty. If you want to try something hard, try shipping hazmat internationally. And if you want to try something impossible, try shipping it from international back to America. That will not happen. America does not import explosives through private hands. Okay. Any questions?
Just a comment that the World Cup is open pretty much to most people.
Yeah, the
Not
World
a
Cup
team,
is open. Come on,
there's not a
come on
team
out and fly and
process.
just check it
Where are
out.
those?
It's in June this year in Chicago, just outside Chicago. Pat throws a truly wonderful event. It's way above what a regional would be. Huge fun. It's in June. It's called the Great Lakes Cup. Big fun.
Wasn't there another one that you mentioned?
The Capital Cup was held last fall.
Oh, okay.
So we hold the Capital Cup in the fall of odd-numbered years and the Great Lakes Cup in the summer of even-numbered years. So, okay. Thanks for attending the presentation.
Where did you say you
Thank
make
you,
a trip?
Thank you.
NARCS sells them.
Who?
NARCS, NAR Tech Services sells them.
Fool knows that. Okay, well,